Welcome again, everyone. Glad to have you. I feel privileged to be with so many people to have this conversation about how we can use nitrogen more efficiently, or maybe better stated, because it seems like nitrogen efficiency has become a bit of a hype. How can we have production, profitability, and consistency of profitability year in and year out and not be dependent on or as dependent on nitrogen inputs? I've been intrigued how many nitrogen efficiency webinars that have come across in advertisements and so forth in the last couple of weeks. It just seems like that's all people are talking about. So here we go. We're going to talk about it too, but we're going to talk about the hype of it. No, not really. I just find it interesting that when nitrogen prices went up, everybody started talking about nitrogen efficiency. And I think it's a very good thing, actually. I think when we stop to consider why do we use nitrogen and are we getting from nitrogen what we're paying for it, it will really help us to take a good solid look and make good solid decisions in our programs. So let's dive right into the webinar today. We're going to focus a bit on efficiency. Just think about efficiency and how it applies to our operation, to your operation. So as we go through these efficiency slides, I'd like for you to just think about where are you in your operation? Are your inputs as efficient as possible? Where do you find yourself in that? And we'll talk about the AEA nitrogen efficiency program, how it works, and we'll look at the big picture of nitrogen cycle, which is where you really need to be focusing on. Is nitrogen critical for your success? I think a lot of people in conventional agriculture have become dependent on nitrogen. And as we can see here, looking at this graph, we see on the left where 2008 nitrogen prices spike in 2012. They drop back down, and now we're back. This is actually just to December 2021, so this has gotten even worse. So what happens when nitrogen prices are up? What happens when nitrogen prices are down? It tends to be that whenever the prices are down, people tend to put more on, and when they're up, people put on less. The question is that profitable? Is that sustainable? Is that what is going to help you win and be successful and have a successful operation to pass on to the next generation? Because if you just cut back, not putting on enough, as you can see by this picture, can be a problem. If you don't have enough power, if you don't have enough energy to grow that crop, then there's going to be an issue. Now, when we think about energy and we think about plants' energy, people quickly relate that to nitrogen. And while nitrogen is a very strong growth energy, there are many other nutrients that are important to have in balance in order to grow a very healthy and so build soil at the same time. If we're growing a very vegetable and at the same time we're burning off carbon and organic matter, then not a good thing. So just because nitrogen prices are up, I would caution you to not just drop your nitrogen, because you might drop it too low, or you might not have enough nitrogen to accomplish the job. On the flip side, maybe you've been applying way too much nitrogen for what is needed to get the job done, and you can cut back substantially and still have plenty of power to get the job done. Pulling a little camper with a semi-trailer, if you're traveling across the U.S., touring the U.S., that's not a very efficient way, right? So in this scenario, you'd be able to cut way back on your energy and still have plenty to accomplish the job. And that's really where a lot of people find themselves, is they've been applying too much nitrogen. And so they're able to cut way back and still have enough nitrogen to accomplish the job. Or maybe you're using about the right amount of horsepower or energy or nitrogen inputs, or you have been in the past, and you'd like to still cut back. There's things that you can do to help make sure that you don't cut back too far, or that you still have enough energy or nitrogen to grow a healthy. Some people like to fill their tank when they're traveling, let's say on a road trip, they fill their tank once. They don't want to stop again until the end of their trip. And they try to put enough fuel in the tank to last the whole trip. And as we can see here, that causes problems too. I don't think any of us would look at this and say that it's a good idea to try to put more fuel in the tank than we're able to hold. We need more tanks on the truck if we don't want to stop for more fuel on our trip. So we'll talk about that a bit later in how do we, in our soil, create a greater holding capacity. The other thing that we have to be careful about is what kind of fuel we use for what vehicle. If we put jet engine fuel in our car, it might be fun for a little bit, but it won't last very long. And I think that's what has happened as people have put on soluble nitrogen and soluble fertilizer products on their soils. They have had some fun for a while, but putting on very soluble, and the more soluble and more refined that these products and materials are, it tends to be harder on the soil. So think anhydrous ammonia, think diammonium phosphate or DAP, think potassium chloride. So the higher the analysis in your fertilizer, or the more refined that it is, it tends to create more issues much more quickly. The less refined, the less refined that it is, and the more as it's found in nature, the more it'll flow with the soil and with the biology and do less harm. Think about the form of nitrogen that you're using, and think about how they are affecting the soil and the long-term effect of these materials in your soil. Now that we've looked at the forms that we use, the rates that we apply, and the timing of our application, let's look at what we have put together at AEA as a way or as a toolbox to help you use nitrogen as efficiently as possible. And then we'll look at the big picture of what we really need to be thinking about when we think about nitrogen. So let's say that you are still applying soluble nitrogen. You're applying 3200 or 2800, or you're applying a solubilized urea, which is the preferred source, our preferred source of nitrogen because of how close it is to an amino acid, and the amount of energy that it takes is much less than converting, say, a nitrate to an amino acid. So when we have urea, it's more energy efficient to convert that into a stable protein form. An efficiency program is made up of humicarb, rejuvenate, molybdenum, and sulfur. And we're going to look at each of these and why we have added them to the program, what role they play. So humicarb is derived from humolite ore, which has a very high CEC and a high AEC, which means anion exchange capacity. And so as compared to a soil, we're looking at like a 300 part per million cation exchange capacity and something like a 250 part per million anion exchange capacity. So this means there's a tremendous holding capacity for anions and cations in the humicarb. One of the unique things about humicarb, as compared to other humic acids, is that humicarb is not an alkali extraction product. When humicarb is manufactured, it's manufactured in such a way that it contains all the humin fraction. And what I'm talking about there is simply that when humic acids are manufactured, they will put the leonardite or the humulite or whichever ore they're starting with, and they will put it into an alkali extraction. They'll extract the fulvic acid off, they'll put it into an acid solution, and they'll extract the humic acid, and then they'll throw whatever couldn't be extracted by alkali or by acid, they'll throw that away. Now think about that for a second. Can't be broken down by alkali or by acid. Is that seems like something that would be beneficial to have in the soil as long-term carbon source, right? Not broken down by alkali or by acid. So with humicarb, the manufacturing process allows the humic acid, the fulvic acid, and that humin fraction, that fraction that can't be broken down by alkali or acid, is all contained in humicarb. And what this means is that there is a tremendous holding capacity. There's a huge surface area. When you think about the surface area, the smaller the particles, the more surface area you will have, because of each particle will have more surface area, and you still have the same amount of volume, but you have more surface area. And we attempted to run some calculations, and I don't know how accurate these really are, but there's a huge, if you calculate that most of the particle sizes are 1 micron or less in the humicarb, then that means there could be something between 2 and 3 square miles of surface area in 1 gallon of humicarb. And when you look at a humate under a microscope, you can kind of get the idea. So this is a humate particle, and you see all these little porous cave-like structures, and each of these little aggregates will have an anion and a cation exchange capacity. So when we mix this with nitrogen, what happens is that nitrogen will be absorbed to the outside, or kind of complexed. It's not a chelation where it's actually encapsulated, but it's lightly attached to the outside of these very porous carbon molecules. And what that does is very interesting and very amazing, and very different than most of the nitrogen stabilization products. Actually, I could probably say all of the nitrogen stabilization products that we've looked at, because this is a very natural process. It's a system that can take this nitrogen and keep it in a stable form and not be hurting the biology at the same time. Now let's just look at this in comparison. Look at those two. Can you guess what the one on the right? That's sand under a microscope. So when you look at a sand crystalline structures, or look at them under a microscope, you see it's hard, it's shiny. There's very little place where nitrogen is able to attach itself to, or to kind of hide in. So when we have a sand compared to a humate, we can see why the humate in the humicarb is so powerful in stabilizing the nitrogen. Now, when you when you don't have the humic acid, or when you just have, you probably have some of that holding capacity, but way, way, way less than when you have that humin fraction still intact. The next component in the nitrogen efficiency program is rejuvenate. Rejuvenate is a blend of complex carbohydrates, soluble carbons, and it's in the nitrogen efficiency program as a support package to encourage the microbes to really flourish. What we want to do is to microbial community quickly reproducing and taking this nitrogen and converting it from soluble nitrate and or ammonium compounds to a stable amino acid or protein form. And in that form, the plant is able to take them up right in that form, or it can be utilized for microbial energy. It's a form that's not going to leach out of the soil very easily at all. So the rejuvenate gives you that support package to get that biology moving, to help that biology get started. And then we add rebound molybdenum. And these, the rejuvenate and the molybdenum, depending on where your soil is, depending on what program you've applied, maybe you have enough molybdenum in the soil that this, you wouldn't have to add this, but molybdenum is needed as an enzyme cofactor for the nitronase reductase enzyme. And when you don't have that, the nitrogen can't be converted from nitrates to ammonia and to ammonium. And so it just stays stuck in the nitrate form, which will then be converted to nitrite and then dies as N2 gas. So the molybdenum is there and in the program just to make sure that we have a little bit of molybdenum to facilitate that nitrate reductase process. And then the sulfur. Sulfur is typically added with ammonium thiosulfate. Calcium thiosulfate could be an option if you needed calcium. And the reason we add the sulfur is because of the sulfur that's needed in to build amino acids. So, and sulfur is also an anion, which will easily leach out of the soil. So a lot of soils today are deficient in sulfur. And if we are applying the nitrogen and we don't have sufficient levels of sulfur, then even if we support the biology, even if we inoculate biology, we're not able to convert that soluble nitrogen into the protein form because we don't have the sulfur. Sulfur is the missing link. So we like to make sure that we have a 10-to-1 nitrogen to sulfur ratio, enough sulfur to have that 10-to-1 ratio. We have been running the nitrogen efficiency program for a couple years, and we've been seeing a lot of results in the crops. Some of the results that I've seen in crops is where leaves on corn are staying green longer. So the treatment versus the control, you have green leaves for a longer time frame. So that means you have more photosynthesis. And when I was preparing for this, I asked the laboratory or the R&D department to run a trial where they mixed just urea into soil, and they simulated a rain, and then they mixed urea with the nitrogen efficiency program, simulated a rain, and they measured the leachates. And as you can see, we had 0.08 in the nitrogen efficiency program and 1.35% of nitrogen in the urea only. And we're hoping to run this out throughout a season so we can actually measure the effectiveness and as far as keeping that stable. And what I so much like about this nitrogen efficiency program is because it's in a natural form. Carbon is what we have lost or destroyed through our practices over the last century. And so now this is one small way that we can come in and add more carbon, keep that nitrogen in a stable form until the plant needs it. And so the carbon is in a form that the biology can recognize. It's in a form that actually helps the biology. And it's in a form that will build the overall soil system and aggregation from a soil aggregation standpoint. Some of the other nitrogen stabilization programs that are out there that I think is important to just be aware of. And I'm not saying that there's never a place for these or that you shouldn't use them, but rather just to think about how they affect the bigger picture. So one of those is the urease enzyme inhibitors, where there's a product applied to the urea that will inhibit the enzymes from converting the urea. It'll keep it in that urea form for a longer period of time. And then when that product wears off, supposedly, that urea starts converting and from urea to amino acids or to nitrates and becoming available. The concern I have about this is just simply that whenever we're inhibiting enzymes and we're talking about biological functions, we inhibit one enzyme. My question is always, do we inhibit any other enzymes? Do we inhibit any other biology? What's the cascade effect of inhibiting an enzyme to lengthen or delay that nitrogen cycle? Another way, and I've seen this used a lot and with success, I would say, is the polymer coatings, where dry urea is spread and has a polymer coating, and that polymer coating will degrade slowly. Some coatings will delay, over a longer period of time, and others will break down over a shorter period of time. The challenge I have with this is, one, I'm not sure how fond I am of just spreading plastic on my field all the time, but then also and this is something we have seen a good number of times where people applied this fertilizer, and most of these scenarios would have been more than just nitrogen. I'm talking like a fertilizer mixed with the polymer coatings to give it a slow release effect. And you add biology to it because of all the good things biology does, and suddenly you have this polymer coating being degraded at a much faster rate than what you had planned for. So you have your nutrient availability at times when your plant may not be ready for that. And it's still in a very soluble form. It's still in a form that is very, the plant's going to suck it up and could create an imbalance because of it being released at a time when the plant's not at a critical point of influence where you really want that much nitrogen. Another form of stabilizing nitrogen, and especially urea, is reacting it with formaldehyde, and then that product is a very stable product. Again, I've had some experiences, some anecdotal experiences, and I guess I'll just say it this way: when I think about putting formaldehyde in a soil that I'm hoping to really be building and be depending or trying to get the biology to function, to put on formaldehyde just kind of gives me an uneasy feeling. So all of these have their pros, have their, I would say, more cons than when we look at building the whole, a system that fits into the pattern of nature. And that's where I would like to look at the nitrogen cycle. This really is where, you're putting on nitrogen. The best thing you do is put on the nitrogen efficiency program. The best thing you can do is stabilize that nitrogen in the tank. Make sure you have molybdenum. Make sure you have some very available short chain carbon in there. Make sure you have sulfur to nitrogen ratio right. those are things that you can do as you continue to put on nitrogen, because you may need nitrogen. When you are first starting to transition, it's rarely a good idea to go from a bushel or a pound of nitrogen for a bushel of corn and just put on 0. That's rarely a good idea. So using carbon, using sulfur, using the carbohydrates, and really encouraging or reducing the amount of nitrogen and doing everything we can to make it as efficient as possible is really a good idea, which is where the program comes in. You know what, I should make sure, since John's not on here to stop me if people can't hear me, I should just make sure that I don't have the chat.
Hearing you come through loud and clear, David, if it helps.
Okay, great.
Every now and then I get a little blurb, but I haven't lost track of what you're talking about. So.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jack. Okay, so let's look at the nitrogen cycle. Nature is the winner. Will always be. Nature will always bat last. Nature will be the winner. Are you on her team? Let's look at this nitrogen cycle. Does it look familiar to you? Does it make any sense? Probably not a lot. So let's look at this. This is the fertilizer prices. So this is the cycle that nitrogen has taken throughout the years. And you can see it's up and it's down and it's up and it's down. The graph on the right is showing the corn price cycle. And it looks very similar to the trend that we are seeing in the nitrogen price cycle. Why do I put this into a nitrogen efficiency program presentation? What's the reason that I want to draw this correlation? It's because your profitability, looks to me, is always kind of the same. For you to really get ahead and put more money in the bank, well, every time corn prices go up, nitrogen prices were up first or go up as well. So I'd like to take a moment and just encourage you to take control. It's yours. It's your operation. It's for you to look at, to say, well, why am I doing this? Is this what is needed? Well, how does this work? And that's one of the things that we at Advancing Eco Agriculture really promote, is that our growers are engaged with what's happening, that they're a part of the decision-making process, and that they are able to make knowledgeable decisions. So make it be as efficient as possible. Use as much as is needed and not more. Stabilize and convert it into a protein form as quickly as possible, and keep it from leaching and volatilizing. Think about the compost sources. Maybe there's alternative sources like compost manure or compost tea that bring you additional carbon, or that fit into your system and allow you to get enough nitrogen. Remember, we're kind of talking about nitrogen inputs, but really at this point, let's kind of shift our focus from nitrogen inputs and how we can make those nitrogen inputs as efficient as possible. And let's think about how can we get nitrogen more efficiently than what we are getting it with conventional nitrogen fertilizers. So compost manure, compost teas, fish hydrolysis, or plant-based proteins. Or how is it that we have been sold so much nitrogen, tons and tons and tons and hundreds of thousands of tons of nitrogen sold every year, when the atmosphere is made up of 78, 79% nitrogen gas? The atmospheric gas that we breathe has about 78% nitrogen. And when you spread nitrogen on on your fields, or when you solubilize nitrogen and you put it in your sprayer, that nitrogen was taken from the atmosphere by an industrial process. And it can be done by microbial and a natural process. I scratch my head at how we have missed that beauty or that valuable resource, and we have poured so much of our fertilizer budget into nitrogen. And understand where we are today, and I think it's important to be clear that where we are today, as far as the soils, the health of the soils, or maybe it's not even soil anymore. In some places, it's just simply dirt. We don't have the ability to utilize the resource of this atmospheric nitrogen. But that's the goal. And that's why we need to be thinking further ahead than this year and next year. We need to be thinking 10 years ahead. We need to be budgeting for 10 years. We need to be thinking about where we want to be in 10 years from today, and what do we need to change in our practices in order to get to the place where we can get most, if not 100%, of our nitrogen from this atmospheric gas by having it exchange in the top, in the soil, the top 6, 8, 10, 12 inches, having that nitrogen being fixed by these specialized organisms, and the crop taking it up. And it's a beautiful cycle, same as the carbon cycle. It's a wonderful cycle. And we need to think about how our actions affect this cycle and what the long-term effect of breaking that cycle will be. Are we prepared to pay for it? So the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere, the Haber-Bosch technique, was discovered in 1914, where atmospheric nitrogen and hydrogen are passed over a catalyst at 100 degrees Celsius and under pressures of several hundred atmospheres. So a tremendous energy demanding process to take nitrogen from the atmosphere. Another very high energy process that does this is lightning. When you see a thunderstorm and you see a lightning bolt, that's actually will have enough heat and pressure to break apart the N2 gas, which is the N2 molecule, which is just simply two nitrogens bonded, is a very stable molecule. So breaking it takes a lot of energy, and lightning has enough energy to do that. But if we activate the enzymes, the nitronase reductase enzymes, the rhizoctonia is one of those bacteria that has an association with legumes that will fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. And there's also nitrogen fixers that don't have to have a symbiotic relationship with plants. So the key is that we need to think about how do we utilize the nitrogen that's in that atmosphere? Why pay for it? Pound for pound, when we are able to capture it from that free source. It's out there. This slide is just simply to show the different different oxidation levels of nitrogen. So we have nitrate on the top, which is very oxidized, and ammonia on the bottom, which is very reducing. Or this slide where we have ammonium on the left, which is very reduced, and nitrate on the top, which is very oxidized. And so when we think about gas exchange, and when we think about biology, and we think about what are our applications of nitrogen doing, if we're putting out 3200 and we have a very high nitrate mix, we are on the right side of this graph, which is very oxidized. And when we're that's a very disease-enhancing soil. So when you put out nitrogen, let's do everything that we can to not create an oxidized or a disease enhancing situation, but rather using sources that are more on the reduced side, and or stabilizing it with humates and getting it converted from the nitrate to the stable amino acid and protein form as quickly as possible. This is where it really all starts. In my mind, the whole biological system, if it looks like the picture on the left, we have really, really reduced, if not completely stopped, gas exchange. If we can make it look like the picture on the right, and this is a grower I've been working with in since probably 2013 or 14, and this soil aggregation, the earthworm activity in this cornfield is just phenomenal. And when you think about the soil breathing and gas exchange, and you think about all the earthworm holes, and you think about the structure of that soil, this soil is going to be able to supply a lot, if not all, of the nitrogen that's needed to grow this crop. In fact, this is an organic field, so no soluble nitrogen is used here. There's some dairy manure used, so there's definitely some nitrogen coming into the system, but we have this structure that really allows the system to function throughout the season based on when the plant really needs it. And so I just wanted to kind of bring this to a close by having us think about the whole nitrogen cycle. Up top here, we have the N2 gas I was talking about. And so we convert that to fertilizer, which could either be ammonia or ammonium, and could also come from the N2 coming right down into the soil and nitrogen in fixation. And then that ammonia or ammonium is converted to nitrate. Nitrate's taken up by the plant. Nitrogen is assimilated amino acids, and organic matter is put back down. Or if that doesn't happen, we have denitrification, and it's put back up into the atmosphere or is leached out into the waterways. Now, this is just a conventional nitrogen cycle, and there's a couple pieces missing here that we've not been able to get added in at this point yet, but we really need the whole biological system. What happens with the bacteria? What if we can convert this NH4 and or the NO3 at any point in this cycle and convert it to microbial biomass? And eventually that microbial biomass will be assimilated by the plant or by other microbes and could potentially be converted back to NO3, but most likely it will stay in a very stable form. So don't put on more nitrogen than you need. Stabilize it. Make sure that you have carbon, because if you have soluble nitrogen and you put it into the soil or on the soil, I think you've probably all heard of people spraying nitrogen on their crop residue like corn stalks to help break it down faster. Well, if you put nitrogen out in the soil and you have carbon out there, it will help your carbon break down faster. So when you mix it with carbon, especially a carbon like humicarb, where you have the humin fraction, then it will have much less of that carbon burning effect on your soil organic matter. Put out what you need. Put it out when you need it, as closely as possible. And I would say the further you are, the further the application is from when your plant is going to need it, the more important it's going to be to put on greater amounts of humicarb or of your humate to make sure that you have all of it stabilized and in a stable form. In other words, you're adding more tanks to that truck so that If you want more nitrogen than what you have holding capacity, so when you look at your soil, the higher the organic matter, the higher the carbon level, the higher the clay level even, the more nitrogen you'll be able to hold without it just being wasted and leaching and oxidizing back off. So we welcome you to join the many other growers on this regenerative journey. We welcome you to connect with us as we work with growers to increase their profitability and help them be successful, not today and tomorrow only, but in 2 decades from now, in 2 generations from now. That's what we need to be thinking about. The answer lies not only in today and tomorrow, but in 2 generations. So with that, if you have any questions, if you'd like to get started, feel free to call the customer care team at 800-495-6603, email hello@advancingecoag.com, and go to the website to sign up for the newsletter, and don't miss out on any of the podcast videos and all the wealth of information that John has put out there. And with that, we will fire off Q&A. And I put this recipe here on this last slide. If you missed the recipe for the nitrogen efficiency program, here it is. And I will leave this up here as we go through the Q&A. All right, so let me open the Q&A here. All right. All right, John Hack. I have wood chips under my tree rows. Here in Arizona, my original organic content was 1%. Now under the tree row, it is 18% in the top 10 inches. The worms have come, wondering if biosolids are a risky way to release and to modify the carbon to nitrogen ratio. Looks like if I'm reading this correctly, John, maybe you have more carbon than nitrogen, and how do we deal with that? If you have a lot of wood chips under your trees, you have too much carbon. Biosolids are always risky. Definitely want to be careful to make sure you don't have any heavy metals. Biosolids can also have antibiotics. So definitely check out. I have seen decent biosolids, and I have seen biosolids that I would not allow close to my farm. So definitely check out the biosolids, John, on what quality they are. The other thing that you can do is apply some sea shield, which is a nitrogen source. The wood chips will need to be digested by fungi first because of the lignin content, and add some biodigester, and maybe even a bit of rejuvenate in there would be helpful on top of the wood chips. The biodigester is designed to digest very lignified carbons. So biodigester is where I would start with that, and then adding some sea shield and rejuvenate. And then biosolids, I mean, adding a little bit of nitrogen in that form is not a bad idea, as long as you're not bringing in something that would actually hamper the microbial response. All right, we have Rafe Muhammad. Thank you for being here. Let's see, ammonium is producing in compacted soils and nitrate is in tilled soil. If sulfur and soluble carbon is not there, then will it burn soil organic carbon by itself? Yes, I believe what you are asking is if we put out nitrogen and we don't have carbon with it, and we don't have enough sulfur with it, then yes, it will burn up the carbon, the organic matter, and the carbon in the soil, which is what has happened over these, the last 90 to 100 years since we've had soluble carbon or soluble nitrogen, is it's burned off the carbon at a faster rate than it's being put back by the crop. if there's a crop there, then that carbon that's being released as carbon dioxide will be captured by the plant and put back down into the soil, and you have a carbon cycle, and you're not losing the carbon. So it's about the carbon cycle. Losing carbon is not bad. In fact, it's important. But if you don't have a crop there to capture the carbon dioxide being released, then that cycle is broken and your carbon dioxide is gone, and the organic matter in your soil is going to go down. Question from Gio. Thank you for being here today. What's the percentage of nitrogen that's stabilized by the humates? If you're using humicarb at 3% of the total solution, a very high percentage. I don't have an exact percent, but it's going to be probably in the 90% of the nitrogen, if not 100% of the nitrogen will be stabilized. The humicarb is a very strong stabilizing agent. Dave Hanson has a question here. How do you control the effect biology has on what form nitrogen stays in? Ammonium nitrate and ammonium nitrogen to nitrate and vice versa. Can you apply nitrogen in one form and unintentionally convert because biology got it before the plant? Yes, good question. And the answer to that, or my understanding to that, Dave, is that the best way to control is to have the nitrogen converted into a protein or into the biological form, where biology uses the nitrogen to for their own building their own bodies, etc., and are building that into a form of protein so that they stay in that form. Having enough carbon and having enough sulfur, molybdenum, all of those things are important to and will affect in how quickly they convert. And the other thing that will have an effect is the bacterial to fungal ratio. So when you think about a forest or a perennial polyculture like a prairie, that nitrogen is released based on when the plant starts sending photosynthase down into the soil. And so your nitrogen release curve and how much nitrogen you're putting out there is really dependent on the weather, on temperatures, and when we put out the soluble forms of nitrogen, making sure we have as many of those components there to keep it in a stable form is the best we know at this point of how to affect that. Wow, we have a lot of questions here. A lot of great questions. Okay. So would you recommend to measure the ammonium nitrogen levels in the soil, and how much of that form of nitrogen can be counted as crop available? The best way, Lisa, that I know to measure the nitrogen levels in the soil is the Haney analysis, and looking at the different forms of indicators of how much nitrogen you have. So measuring nitrogen directly, looking at the microbial response, the CO2 burst. They have a whole list of measurements on measuring nitrogen. So that is probably the best test that I know of to get a good idea of how much nitrogen you have today in the form of nitrogen, and how much nitrogen that could potentially become available in the next, throughout the season, based on carbon and based on microbial activity. Question from Gord. If you add carbon to stabilize nitrogen, will products like UAN stop volatilizing and no longer smell of ammonium in the tank? I'm using 1 pound of humic acid powder per acre, but maybe that's not enough. Yes, we have experience where that will definitely greatly reduce it. And if you want to stabilize all of it, just put carbon in until you don't get it. And humic acid powder most of the water soluble humic acid has gone through that alkali extraction process that I talked about, and will not have that human fraction, will not be able to stabilize like the humicart will. So I definitely put in that 3% and see what that does. And you always add a little bit more if that's not taking most of that odor away. What are my thoughts on commercial inoculants of nitrogen fixing bacteria, Envita, Utrecia, and others designed to infect the plant? A worthwhile tool in the toolbox, question mark. Yes, I think there is a possibility that some of those products will have some merit. My concern with these single strain bacterial inoculants is that it's not a holistic system. And so when we think about fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere directly to the plant, what are the enzyme cofactors that are needed, and what other bacteria and or components are needed in order for that to be successful? So I'm not seeing any side-by-sides of when we have sufficient levels of bacteria in the soil and nitrogen fixation or nitrogen fixing bacteria and good gas exchange as compared to just spraying it on the crop, which is something to consider. Is, does it work to just have a silver bullet and we put it on and we get nitrogen? What's the long-term picture, and what's the biggest limiting factor? So yeah, definitely a tool to check out for sure, but think about diversity and think about the whole system. For nitrogen to sulfur ratio, is magnesium sulfate a good option? Yes, if you're low in magnesium sulfate could be a good option. It doesn't have, I guess there is a decent amount of sulfur actually in magnesium sulfate. So yeah, that could be an option. Just make sure that you don't have just do a char test, make sure it doesn't react and mixes well. I don't see any reason to not use it unless you don't need magnesium. In other words, if you have excessive magnesium in your soil, you don't want to be putting out more magnesium. Ned O'Brien, thank you, Ned, for your question. In a grazing situation where it is grazed every 21 to 28 days, where is unused nitrogen stored after a foliar application? I assume you are saying the foliar application would be a foliar application of nitrogen. And if there's excessive levels of nitrogen at that and applied as a foliar, the only reason that it that's such an if-then question. So when you say, when we think of excesses, an excess of nitrogen simply means more nitrogen you want to grow. So vegetative growth is not limited to time. It's only limited to nutrient availability. And we've specifically been talking about nitrogen, but in this scenario, this is really where, when all of the nutrients are available, what or if you so I guess the excess is just simply if the nitrogen isn't metabolized, it will probably be moved down to the roots, or you will just have a high nitrate number in your plant because it's not been able to utilize it fully. All right, we have a question from Jeremy. Hello, David. I'm an organic farmer. I use manure for my nitrogen before corn. I normally spread 5 tons of 23, 17, 11 chicken manure. So far, it's been easiest. You just spread manure in the winter frozen. I always have a cover crop growing. Is front loading all my nitrogen with manure the same as with other forms of N? Are there ways of managing manure better? Great question, Jeremy. And it's important that, whatever we do, it has to fit in our system, right? So if you're not able to spread manure at any other time, then how do we make the best of that. If there's any possibility you can spread it another time, I would definitely do. If you have a crop and if your chicken manure has enough carbon, and this is probably where the big difference is if you don't have enough carbon, that chicken manure will probably lose a lot of that nitrogen. The ideal time to spread that would be either in late fall when you still have 2 weeks of vegetative growth from your cover crop, or in early spring as soon as you have some crop growing. And I don't know what your specific scenario is there, Jeremy. So, but if you can get that chicken manure into the crop, the cover crop that you're growing, and then incorporate that, allow that cover crop to be the storage tank, you will not lose as much nitrogen because of volatilization throughout the winter, and you will store that nitrogen over a longer period of time throughout the season. The other thing you can do is add carbon to the chicken litter when you're hauling it or before it's cleaned out. I don't know what your scenario is of and how much ability you'd have to do. Adding more carbon, maybe during clean out would be a way of stabilizing some of that nitrogen. We can't get our hands on humicarb, not always readily available where I'm in Ontario. Any lesser source of humic? Can lesser sources of humics be used if we use more per acre? How much more, for example, with UAN on wheat? I think you said we would still be missing capacity. That's correct. Yeah, I don't really know that you'd be able to. I don't know what a good ratio would be of how much humic acid you would have to use. In fact, I don't really think you can't really replace that. So the only way would be if you, I guess you would be increasing the cation exchange capacity, so it would help stabilize the ammonia, but not the nitrate. So yeah, and I would just add there, I'm not sure why it's not always readily available here in Ontario, but connect with our customer care and we'll see what we can do to make get you the humicarb when you need it. All right, we have a question from John Warmerdam. Hey, John, thank you for being here. I'm convinced most nitrogen applications are more plant growth regulators, growth stimulant, rather than an actual fertilizer, since they increase growth, but not by better plant metabolism, resources to make the plant grow larger. Is that something you believe to be true? Wow, that's a deep question. Yes, I think there's definitely something to that, and I think there's that's true for probably any of the foliars that we put on or any kind of fertilizer, is that we are, and especially you can think of this from a number of different aspects, John. When you think of putting on soluble nitrogen in early spring, you are oxidizing the carbon very quickly, so you get a flush of carbon dioxide. And you have to ask the question, well, what effect does that have? You're also increasing the EC because of the salt content. So what does that additional electrical conductivity in the soil do for plant uptake of other nutrients and or of it would be mostly about the chemistry reaction going on there. But then the other thing is, we put on 200 pounds of nitrogen or 100 pounds of nitrogen or even 50 pounds of nitrogen, when what we really are looking to do is apply enough nitrogen. If nitrogen is the limiting factor, and it may not be, it may be that manganese or iron or phosphorus or magnesium are the limiting factor to enhance photosynthesis or to support sugar translocations. So if whatever element we're missing, we should only need to add a very small amount to the plant to give the plant the needed energy to produce more sugars, translocate more sugars to the roots, and have more nutrients become available from the soil. So in that way, definitely I would agree with you, John, that nitrogen in the quantity of nitrogen to actually grow the plant, because, well, there's actually there's a study that John has shown. I was looking for it to put it in this presentation and couldn't find it. That shows that only 2%, I think that was in with potassium. Yeah, I don't remember which of the fertilizers it was, but the highest amount, or the highest percent, was 12% of the applied fertilizer making it into the plant. And so a very limited amount of what is applied actually gets taken up by the plant and utilized by the plant as a, growth material, but is a regulator, and it's a stimulant that triggers the plant. So this small amount allows the plant to go to the next level of energy production, and that energy cycle makes it look like we really got a big response out of that fertilizer. Okay, we have a couple more questions here. What is EDTA doing to soil biology? Good question. I think it's important somebody looks at that. I don't know that I have done a lot of study into the effect in the soil. I know that in the plant, it definitely takes a lot of energy to convert that ETDA or metabolize it, get it out of the system, or it just sits there and hampers the plant. And the soil biology, I cannot imagine that it's doing that it's beneficial at all. Ned O'Brien, if I apply N surplus to the grass requirement, will it be grazed off before it can be utilized? Oh, possibly, yes, possibly, and that's where if you apply that surplus and you graze it before it has chance to be utilized, then that could very well create a major problem in your animals as well, if you have high blood urea nitrogen. So apply less, apply more often, or apply sooner so you have more time. And then if you apply sooner, you're also applying more on the soil, and getting it down into the soil where the plant's utilizing it. So really applying it earlier is going to be key. Question from Brian, will this work for warm season turf? Yes, should work if you're applying nitrogen. It should work for any crop that you're applying nitrogen to. Will just help stabilize the nitrogen, give you a longer release curve. So you can either reduce your nitrogen or put on the same amount of nitrogen and get a longer release curve. Question from Mills. I'm from Europe. We don't have humicarb. Yeah, I'm not familiar with the other humates that you're referencing there. So you'll really just need to be looking for, and if that's the case, you either need a humate that still, or is when you put your humate out, or when you put your nitrogen out, look at the possibility of having some granulated humates, maybe in furrow or spread on the soil. So there may be other alternatives. And really the ultimate thing, remember, your main focus needs to be to look at that whole cycle. How do you get more atmospheric nitrogen into your soil? How do you get better gas exchange? How do you keep your soil from crusting over? What are the things you can do to take advantage of the atmospheric nitrogen gas? Because I'm pretty sure you have about the same amount in Europe as we do over here. We have a question from Daniel Klossmeyer. If you use the nitrogen efficiency program with several applications, can you overload the sugar, humic acid, and the molybdenum levels? Not with just a couple applications. You would have to put on a lot of a lot of applications. And then really the only thing that I'd be concerned about would be, depending on what crops you're growing, that would be the only thing. But in short, Daniel, that's not really been an issue at all. I have growers who are putting on the nitrogen efficiency program on onions throughout the season, 3, 4, 5 applications, and it's allowed them to reduce their nitrogen significantly. Okay, we are a bit over time already. Wow, those last 20 minutes flew by. I think we didn't get to all of those questions. I think we will just wrap it up here. I have a hard stop at 2:10. So I have one more quick question here. What is the recommended amount of sulfur in the soil? We typically like to see a minimum of 35 up to 70 parts per million. Sulfur being an anion should be amended pretty much on an annual basis, and especially in high rainfall areas. So with that, we will wrap up the webinar for today. Thank you again for being on. Thank you for all the great questions. And we will look forward to seeing you in the future.